So far this year, the only way we have solved a quadratic is by factoring. I'm going to now show you how to solve a quadratic by taking the square root. You can only do this if you do not have an x term. So if you have an x squared and a constant, you can solve this way. You cannot have an x term. To do this, you want to get the x squared completely by itself. If the constant's on the same side, you need to add or subtract it to get rid of it. Once you have an x squared on one side and a number on the other side of the equal sign, you need to take the square root of both sides. And when you do that, the square root of x squared is always x, and you take the square root of whatever the number on the other side of the equal sign is. When you put your answer, you need to put a plus or minus sign in front of it. Right? Because when you take the square root of a number, it's not always just positive. Like if I do the square root of 9, right? So the square root tells you what number times itself can equal 9. So I can do 3 times 3 equals 9, but I can also do negative 3 times negative 3. Right? They both equal 9, so therefore the answer to the square root of 9 is positive or negative 3. Okay. So make sure when you put your answer down, you have to have a plus or minus sign in front of it. For our first example here, x squared minus 9 equals 0. We only have an x squared term and a constant, so we can factor by square root. So you want to add 9 to both sides to get x squared by itself. 9's cancel. Okay. And then we want to take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is just x. This is kind of like I talked about on the last slide. Square root of 9 is 3, but it can be positive or negative 3. So make sure you have that plus or minus sign in front of it. If we solve this by factoring, this is difference of perfect squares. So difference of perfect squares, if you remember correctly, you did your two binomials, and we took the square root of both, so square root of x squared is x, square root of 9 is 3, put a plus in one, a minus in the other, and set them equal to 0. Okay, and then we broke them apart, set them equal to 0, and solve for x. Okay, so we would subtract 3, x would equal negative 3. Here we would add 3, so x would equal positive 3. So right there it shows you that when you did it by factoring, you got positive and negative 3. You get the exact same answer when you do square root, it's just a lot less steps involved. For the next equation, we have a couple steps we need to do before we can take the square root. You always want to get rid of your constant first, get rid of the number by itself, so you want to subtract 1 on both sides. This gives you 5x squared equals 125. Then x squared is still not by itself, so I need to divide both sides by 5. My 5's cancel, and it gives me x squared. 125 divided by 5 is 25. And then take the square root of both sides. The square root of x squared is just x. The square root of 25 is 5, and do not forget to put your plus or minus in front of it. So just like when we factored by, or we saw by factoring, this answer still tells me where the graph crosses the x-axis. So if I were to graph this, my graph would cross at negative 5 and at positive 5. So if we drew the parabola, it would look something like that. Okay. Go ahead and pause the video and do the first you try yourself. So most of the work is done for you on this one. X squared is already by itself. So to solve, you just simply need to take the square root of both sides. Square root of x squared is x. Square root of 36 is positive or negative 6. Go ahead and pause and do the second you try. A little more work involved in this one. You want to get x squared by itself, so first subtract 4 both sides. Gives you 16x squared equals 16. Divide by 16. x squared would equal 1. 16 divided by 16 is 1. Take the square root of both sides. Square root of x squared is x. The square root of 1 is positive and negative 1. So when you want to solve by square root, you can only have an x squared and a constant. You cannot have an x term. You want to get the x squared by yourself, take the square root of both sides, and your answer needs to have a plus or minus sign in front of it.